I was in Philadelphia for a financial summit, just stepping off stage after a keynote when my phone rang. It was my husband, Richard. I expected a quick check-in, maybe a casual, "How's the trip?" or "When will you be back?" But instead, his voice came through cold, deliberate, and disturbingly satisfied, like he had just scored a win in a game I didn't even know we were playing. "We're getting a divorce," he said flatly. "Oh, and by the way, I've already sold the house." My heart didn't drop out of shock. It paused because of how effortlessly he said it, like tossing away trash he no longer needed. No guilt, no hesitation, not even a hint of concern about where I would go or what I would do. I stood there in the hallway of the hotel, my hand tightening around the phone as he kept talking, now about his fresh start with someone named Cassandra, a name I had seen before in vague late-night messages and unexplained weekend trips. I'd suspected, but hearing it out loud, that was different. That made it real. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I simply said, "All right." Because what Richard didn't know, and what would soon shatter his smug little world, was that the house he thought he had sold hadn't been in his name for months, and the only thing he had truly given away that day was the last shred of control he thought he had over me. My name is Margaret Hale, and until that phone call, I truly believed I had married a man I could grow old with, a partner, not just in life, but in purpose, in building something meaningful together. Richard and I had been married for 6 years, and while it wasn't always picture perfect, I had held on to the belief that, at our core, we were working toward the same future. The townhouse on Maple Street, tucked away in a quiet corner of Evanston, had felt like a milestone, a home we could finally call ours. Not just a structure of brick and wood, but a vessel for memories, shared dreams, and quiet mornings with coffee on the porch. We had fought hard to get there, scrimping, saving, delaying vacations, forgoing luxuries, passing up things we wanted, so that one day we could own something that was truly ours. And when we signed the papers for the house, I remember thinking that no matter what challenges came next, we had a foundation now, something solid beneath our feet. But in hindsight, I can see the cracks that had already formed beneath that polished exterior. Cracks I chose to ignore because I thought that love meant looking past imperfections. Richard had a way of brushing off serious conversations with charm and half-truths, turning concerns into jokes and ending arguments with a kiss instead of an answer. I told myself he was just tired, overworked, maybe even scared like I was, and I let things go, especially the money talk, where he always seemed just vague enough to be harmless. I remember how he'd wave me off when I'd ask about our joint accounts or mention refinancing. "Don't worry, Mags," he'd say with that easy smile. "I've got it covered." And because I wanted to believe him, because believing was easier than confronting the truth, I nodded, smiled, and let him keep the wheel. The problem is, when you hand someone full control without accountability, you don't just lose track of the road, you lose your power. And I had been quietly giving mine away for years. That day, after his call, I sat in the back of the conference room pretending to take notes while my entire world spun around me. The shock hadn't fully set in, but a cold clarity started to rise in its place. Richard thought he had won. He thought that with a phone call, he could rip the ground out from under me, take the home I had helped build, and leave me scrambling in his rearview mirror while he rode off into some new life with a younger woman and a clean slate. But there was one detail he had completely overlooked, something that would change everything. Months ago, while we were refinancing the house to get a better rate, I had insisted the deed be transferred into my name alone. At the time, it seemed like a practical step, a small protection in case anything ever went wrong. Richard hadn't paid much attention to the paperwork. He signed what was handed to him, confident in his position, probably assuming I would never stand up for myself or that he could smooth talk his way through any fallout. That decision, quiet, calculated, and mine, was about to become the single most important move I had ever made. And Richard, he had just unknowingly set the stage for his own undoing. The rest of that day felt like I was floating underwater, sounds muffled, people's voices passing by without meaning, as I sat through meetings with a forced smile, pretending to care about market trends and investment forecasts, all while my mind played Richard's voice on an endless loop. Every word had cut through me like a blade dipped in contempt. But it wasn't just what he said. It was how he said it, with that smug certainty that I would crumble, that I would fold quietly like I always had, without a fight, without a voice. When I finally returned to my hotel room, I didn't fall apart the way he might have expected. There were no tears soaking the pillows, no wine bottles or desperate calls to friends at midnight. Instead, there was a stillness, cold and calculated, the kind that follows when the hurt is too deep to name, and the only thing keeping you upright is the realization that you are completely and utterly alone. It's a strange kind of pain, being betrayed not by a stranger or an enemy, but by the one person you believed would protect your heart. The man I'd built a life with had not only decided to throw that life away. He had already sold the roof over my head, as if I were just some temporary occupant, as if the memories made within those walls had meant nothing at all. And he hadn't even bothered to tell me in person. No discussion, no explanation, just a phone call and a laugh. But the part that stung most wasn't the house. It was the truth I'd tried so hard not to see. Looking back, I can't count the number of times I'd caught glimpses of Cassandra's name on his screen or overheard half-whispered phone calls that ended the moment I walked into the room. The weekends he claimed he was visiting his brother in Ohio or staying late to close a deal began to pile up in my memory like a trail of unspoken confessions, and each one now fell into place with a cruel kind of clarity. The woman he had left me for wasn't some sudden infatuation. She was a fixture, someone who had slowly taken up space in his life, while I'd been too busy keeping our lives afloat to notice the emotional erosion happening right beneath my feet. And the worst part? He made it sound like I was the obstacle, like he was doing me a favor by leaving. I spent that night replaying every red flag I had ignored, every dismissive glance, every financial document he'd rushed me to sign. Every moment he'd made me feel like asking questions was a sign of mistrust instead of accountability. I had loved Richard with the kind of devotion that puts blinders on your better judgment, and now I was paying the price for my silence, for my faith, for my willingness to believe in a man who had no problem tearing me apart while claiming it was just time to move on. But somewhere between that quiet devastation and the early morning light filtering through the hotel curtains, something inside me shifted. The grief was still there, pressing against my chest like a weight I couldn't shake. But under it, something new began to stir. Resolve. If Richard thought I was going to roll over and watch him erase my life without consequence, then he hadn't been paying nearly as much attention as he thought. I didn't know exactly what my next step would be, but I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't going to end the way he'd planned. By the time I returned to my hotel room that evening, the ache in my chest had begun to give way to something far more useful. Focus. The fog of disbelief had lifted, and in its place was a calm, deliberate sense of purpose that I hadn't felt in years, Perhaps not since before the compromises and concessions of marriage slowly chipped away at my instincts. I wasn't going to let Richard walk away from this unscathed, not because I wanted vengeance in the way people fantasize about it, but because I owed it to myself to stop being the woman who always forgave, who always adapted, who always sacrificed for someone who never once considered doing the same. The first call I made was to Diane. She wasn't just my attorney. She was a friend I'd known since our college days at Purdue, someone who had seen me through life's earlier heartbreaks and never once let me wallow in them. I laid out everything: the call, the claim about the house being sold, the sudden mention of Cassandra, and listened as she responded, not with shock, but with steely resolve. "He sold the house," she repeated, her voice flat with disbelief. "Without your consent? Margaret, he doesn't even have the legal right to do that." I let out a slow breath, one I hadn't realized I'd been holding. "Apparently he thinks he does. He seems to believe I'm too weak or too confused to notice what he's done." "Well," she said with a clipped laugh, "he's about to find out exactly how wrong he is." Diane moved swiftly. It was one of the things I admired most about her. And within hours, she had begun drafting a formal letter to Richard, detailing the illegality of his actions and the consequences he would face if he didn't immediately halt any further steps related to the sale. More importantly, she reminded me of what I had almost forgotten in the chaos of emotional shock: the deed. Transferred months ago during the refinancing, the ownership of the property rested solely under my name. And Richard, in all his arrogance, had never bothered to read the fine print of the papers he'd signed. What he thought was clever manipulation was actually an act of astonishing carelessness, and now he was standing on a house of cards that was already collapsing beneath him. As I listened to Diane outline our next steps with the kind of calm precision that only years of courtroom battles could forge, I felt something in me begin to solidify. For the first time in days, I wasn't reacting, I was planning. I wasn't drowning in grief or pleading for clarity. I was taking control. The next morning, I woke early and poured myself a cup of lukewarm hotel coffee, staring out over the city skyline as the sun stretched over the rooftops. My heart was still bruised, and the betrayal still echoed in my bones. But beneath that pain was a rising clarity. Richard had underestimated me. He had assumed that years of quiet accommodation had made me weak, that my age, my kindness, and my loyalty had dulled my instincts. But what he had failed to realize was that I had learned to endure with dignity, and that endurance had taught me patience, and patience, in turn, had taught me how to wait for the exact right moment to act. I didn't need to scream or threaten or make a spectacle. I had the truth on my side. And more importantly, I had documentation. Indisputable, legally binding truth that would speak louder than any performance Richard might try to stage. He had gambled our future on a lie, and now he was going to pay for it, not with bitterness or spite, but with the clean, cold force of justice. By the time I boarded my flight home that evening, I felt lighter, not because the hurt had vanished, but because it no longer owned me. I had a plan, I had support, and I had every intention of seeing this through to the very end. This wasn't about getting even. It was about reclaiming everything that should never have been taken from me in the first place. When my flight landed back in Chicago, the sky was a dull grey, casting a heavy stillness over the city, the kind that makes you feel like something is about to shift, though you're not sure how or when. I rolled my suitcase across the polished airport floors, checked my phone, and saw a message from Diane. "Buyer has been notified," it read. "They're shocked and furious, cooperating fully. Richard's in for a wake-up call." I allowed myself the smallest smile, not out of malice, but because for the first time in a long while, the truth was working in my favor. The ride home was quiet. I stared out the window of the taxi as familiar streets passed by, each one holding memories I wasn't ready to revisit. But when I stepped into the townhouse, everything felt different. Not because the furniture had moved or the lighting had changed, but because the energy had shifted. Richard's jacket still hung by the door, his shoes were still strewn carelessly on the floor, and the faint scent of his cologne lingered in the air. But none of it felt like it belonged anymore. It was as if the space had already started pushing him out, making room for something truer, something mine. It didn't take long for the storm to arrive. That evening, just as I had sat down to sort through the documents Diane had sent over, the front door slammed open, and there he was, red-faced, breath shallow, and waving the formal legal letter she had emailed that morning. "What the hell is this?" he barked, thrusting the papers toward me like they might burn his hands. "You're saying I can't sell the house? This is half mine." I didn't stand up. I didn't raise my voice. I simply looked at him and replied, calm and even, "No, Richard. It's not. The deed has been in my name for over 6 months. You signed the transfer yourself, remember? Or were you too distracted playing husband to 2 women to read the paperwork?" His face contorted, the arrogance quickly draining from his expression, replaced by a flicker of panic. "That's impossible," he muttered, but there was no conviction in his voice. I reached into the file folder on the table and held up a certified copy of the deed, placing it in front of him like a final chess move. "You wanted a clean break," I said quietly. "Well, here it is." He didn't speak, not right away. He just stared at the paper like it had betrayed him, like the ink itself had conspired to end his fantasy life before it even began. I watched as the realization set in, that he had made a deal on property he didn't own, that the money he might have accepted was now a liability, and that the woman he had planned to build a future with would soon see the truth he never intended to reveal. And speak of the devil. Moments later, Cassandra walked in behind him, all glossy hair and self-satisfaction, her arm hooked through his as if she were staking a claim. She barely glanced at me as she surveyed the house, her tone sickeningly sweet. "So, this is where we'll be staying?" I stood slowly, my heartbeat steady, my voice stronger than I expected. "Number. This is where Richard was staying. You won't be staying here at all." She blinked, clearly confused, then turned toward him. "What's she talking about? You said this was your place, that you sold it, that the money was already—" She stopped mid-sentence, the color draining from her face. "Wait, you didn't lie about that too, did you?" Richard stepped forward, hands up, trying to salvage the performance. "It's complicated," he stammered. "I didn't think—" But I cut him off with a calm that felt like armor. "It's not complicated. You tried to sell a home that doesn't belong to you. The buyer knows, they're pulling out. And if a single cent of that deposit is missing, you'll be dealing with fraud charges. Not just from me, but from the people you lied to." Cassandra's composure cracked completely. She turned toward him, eyes wide with rage and betrayal. "You told me we had a fresh start. You told me everything was settled." He tried to grab her hand, but she yanked it away. "Don't," she said. "I'm not getting dragged into your mess." And just like that, she left. No dramatic exit, no final word. Just a click of the door behind her that felt more satisfying than anything I could have said. Richard stood in the middle of the living room, shoulders slumped, the reality of his unraveling life settling onto him like dust. "You can't do this, Margaret," he said finally, his voice softer now, almost pleading. "We've been through so much." I looked him straight in the eye. "You threw it all away the moment you called me and laughed about leaving me homeless. You didn't just betray me, Richard. You tried to erase me." He reached for the papers on the table. "What is this?" "Divorce," I replied. "Drafted, ready to go. Sign it, and we can both move on. Or don't. And I'll let the courts take care of it." He said nothing as he sank into the couch, the same place where we used to watch movies, talk about retirement plans, argue over paint colours, none of which mattered anymore. I gathered my things, walked to the door, and turned back just once. "And Richard? Don't test me again. Diane's handling everything now. The next time you lie, threaten, or touch what isn't yours, you'll be answering to a judge." Then I left him there, drowning in the consequences of his own design, while I stepped into the night. Not as someone broken, but as someone rebuilt. The days that followed Richard's unraveling were strange. Not peaceful exactly, but still in a way that made space for clarity. His rage had simmered into something more pathetic, a series of missed calls, rambling voicemails that swung from desperate apologies to veiled threats, all left unanswered. While he spiraled, I kept moving forward, each day tightening the bolts of my plan, with Diane working quietly in the background to ensure that every legal corner was sealed shut. The buyer, understandably furious at having their time wasted and their trust manipulated, pulled out of the transaction immediately and was already threatening legal action of their own. Diane had made it clear that if Richard had touched a single penny from the deposit, it would constitute fraud. And while part of me suspected he had, another part hoped for his sake, he hadn't been quite that stupid. But I wasn't banking on hope anymore. I was banking on proof, on leverage, on the very paper trail Richard had left behind, like breadcrumbs leading directly into his own trap. During one of our check-ins, Diane leaned across the table, her tone professional but edged with satisfaction. "You're in a very strong position, Margaret," she said, her fingers tapping the folder between us. "He has no claim to the property, no way to legally challenge the sale's invalidity, and with the divorce proceedings underway, he's running out of ground to stand on." I nodded, the weight of her words sinking in, not as relief, but as confirmation. I hadn't just survived the blow, I had absorbed it and turned it into fuel. And now, the final step loomed. It came sooner than I expected. One evening, while I was organizing the dining room, sorting through old files, boxing up the remnants of a life I no longer claimed, the door opened. I didn't even look up. I knew the sound of his footsteps. Slower now, more unsure. Richard walked into the house like a man trying to reclaim something that no longer recognized him. "You don't have to do this," he said, his voice low, tired, almost unfamiliar in its humility. I didn't answer right away. I placed the last folder on the stack, closed the cabinet, and turned to face him. "Do what, Richard? Protect what's mine? Finish what you started?" He ran a hand through his hair, the confidence that once made him so dangerous, now replaced with a kind of wounded confusion. "I know I made mistakes, but 6 years. We were happy once." "Were we?" I asked, not to mock him, but because I genuinely wasn't sure anymore. "Or were you just comfortable until something shinier came along?" He stepped closer, but the distance between us felt deeper than ever. "You still love me. I know you do. That doesn't just disappear." "No, it doesn't," I admitted. "But respect does. And once that's gone, Love becomes something else, something you survive, not something you celebrate. He looked around the room, taking in the neat boxes, the absence of his things, the subtle rearrangements that had transformed the space into something that no longer felt like ours. "So that's it?" he asked. "You're just throwing it all away?" I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because the irony of his question was unbearable. "I'm not the one who threw it away. You did. When you sold our future for a fantasy and didn't even bother to ask if I had a place to sleep after." He tried again, a last-ditch effort. "You're not being fair." "Fair?" I echoed, stepping closer so he could see that I wasn't angry anymore. Just done. "You lied. You betrayed me. You tried to take everything and assumed I'd just lie down and accept it. But here's what you never understood. I was never yours to control. And this home, this life, this peace, it's mine now. Entirely." He opened his mouth, but no words came. Maybe for the first time in his life, there was nothing left to say that could make it better. I walked over to the kitchen counter, picked up the envelope Diane had sent that morning, and handed it to him. "Divorce papers, already filed. You can sign now or later. But one way or another, this chapter is closed." He took the envelope, eyes fixed on it like it weighed more than he could carry. "You really hate me that much?" I shook my head. "I don't hate you, Richard. I pity you. Because you had a life worth holding on to, and you tossed it aside thinking something newer would make you feel whole. But here's the truth. If you weren't enough without destroying me, you'll never be enough with anyone else." And with that, I turned and walked away. Not because I was trying to be dramatic or make a statement, but because I didn't need to stand there any longer. I had already won. Not just the legal fight, not just the house, but the harder battle, the one for my own self-worth. As I shut the door behind me and let the silence settle back into the room, I realized something I hadn't fully allowed myself to believe until that moment. He was out, and I was finally free. Not just from the marriage, but from the version of myself who thought love meant staying silent. The day Richard left for good, the townhouse exhaled. That's the only way I can describe it, as if the walls themselves had been holding their breath for too long, waiting for the storm to pass. The air felt lighter, the silence more generous, no longer the suffocating kind that clung to grief, but the open kind that allows for stillness, for clarity, and eventually, for peace. I didn't cry after he walked out. I thought I might, but the sadness had already burned through me in the weeks prior, leaving only the ashes of something I no longer wished to rebuild. I sat for a long time on the edge of the bed, looking around the room that used to hold our shared life. The dresser we fought over when we moved in, the art we picked out on a whim at that street fair in Milwaukee, the framed photos I had already taken down but hadn't yet had the heart to throw away. I reached for one, a picture of us at Lake Geneva during our 3rd anniversary, and studied it closely. We looked happy. Maybe we were, or maybe we were just good at pretending. Instead of tossing it, I slid the photo into a manila envelope and placed it in the back of the filing cabinet. I didn't need to see it every day, but I wasn't going to pretend it never happened either. That relationship, for all its hurt and hollowness, had shaped a chapter of my life, but it no longer defined it. Over the next week, I took small steps toward reclaiming the space. I moved the living room furniture around, choosing angles that welcomed light instead of shadows. I replaced the cold, modern artwork Richard liked with pieces I'd kept in storage for years, warm, earthy, imperfect, like me. I filled the kitchen with scents I loved, fresh rosemary, roasted garlic, cinnamon. It wasn't about redecorating. It was about recentering. This wasn't just a house anymore. It was my home. Diane called one afternoon with news. The divorce was finalized. The paperwork had been processed, the settlement closed, and Richard had signed without contest. Likely too exhausted or embarrassed to keep fighting a battle he had already lost. I thanked her and sat quietly for a few minutes after hanging up, letting the word free echo in my mind, like a bell finally released from the tolling of grief. He reached out once more. A text this time. No theatrics, no threats. Just a few lines about regret and a weak hope that we could someday talk again. I stared at the message for a moment, then deleted it. I had no anger left, only disinterest. That was the final shift. Not rage, not heartbreak, but detachment. He no longer had a place in my thoughts. And that, more than any legal document, was the proof that I had truly moved on. A month later, Lauren, my oldest friend, invited me to a rooftop dinner in the city to celebrate. She raised her glass to the skyline and to me, laughing with that familiar mischief in her voice, and said, "To Margaret, who kicked him out, cleaned house, and still found room for joy." I laughed too, a real laugh this time, not one masked by bitterness or weariness. "To peace," I said, clinking glasses with her. Hard-earned, but mine. That night, as I stood by the window of my bedroom with the city lights stretching endlessly in every direction, I realized that this chapter hadn't been about revenge at all. It had been about rediscovery, about finally learning that protecting your peace is not selfish, but sacred. Richard may have tried to take everything from me, but in doing so, he revealed what I was truly made of: quiet strength, unwavering grace, and a resilience that doesn't need applause to exist. Someday, I might leave this townhouse, find a place with no memories at all, just clean walls and wide windows and new beginnings. But until then, I will wake up in this home I fought for, drink coffee by the sunlit window I claimed back from the dark, and remind myself every single day that I didn't just survive, I chose to live. If you've ever had to rebuild from nothing, if you've ever been underestimated, overlooked, or discarded, know this: your quiet strength is louder than any betrayal. And sometimes, the best revenge isn't winning loudly. It's living well, quietly, and completely on your own terms. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear that their second act can be stronger than the first. Subscribe for more stories of justice, healing, and the comeback no one saw coming, the underdog's revenge.